Welcome everyone. We're going to get started in just a few minutes. Give people a little bit of time to get on. You should all be muted right now, but we'll take questions through the chat function. And then at the end of the call, after we've taken questions about this presentation itself, we're going to open it up for a more general discussion. So just give us a couple of minutes and we'll get started. All right, why don't we get started? Welcome everyone for joining us. I know that this is a crazy time for everyone, and we will be sharing the slides and recordings. So if you have colleagues that wanted to participate and can't, don't worry, they'll get them. I believe you're all muted right now, but we will open the phones after the presentation. First, we'll take questions in the chat function, which you should see at the bottom of your screen. And then after we've taken questions about this, we're going to open it up to a little bit of a broader discussion. Let me take a moment to introduce our speaker and to explain what this is based on. And then I want to mention one other thing to you before I turn this over to Dana. So many of you may know Dana Naimark. Dana led the Children's Action Alliance in Arizona for many years. She won the partnership's Florette Angel Award for her child advocacy, based on her many years of achievements. But a couple that you should be aware of in particular were her ability to get the the CHIP program restored in Arizona after it had been canceled, and her critical role in saving the ACA. As you all probably know, Senator John McCain was a critical vote. Dana commissioned a report in December, right after the threat to the ACA became clear, by the state university, exploring what the impact of repeal would be on the state economy. And that undoubtedly shaped the entire discussion in Arizona about whether the ACA should be repealed, and influenced the governor's views. So Dana is a very experienced and much respected member of our child advocacy community. She stepped down from her job in August, I believe, and we promptly commissioned her to do a study of all of the electoral advocacy work that Partnership for America's Children members have done more or less over the last decade, obviously with a greater focus on recent years. And this webinar is her analysis of that report. We will be sharing the report itself in just a day or two when we send out the slides. I'm really thrilled with the work that she did, and that report should be really invaluable to you, both because it shows how important and impactful thoughtful strategies can be, and it also offers a really wide range of strategies for election work. Before I turn this webinar over to Dana, I do want to mention one thing that has arisen pretty much since she finished the report. And that, of course, is that a lot of our state election processes are threatened because of the coronavirus epidemic. And we know, I think it's 3 states now have delayed their primary. There was a court battle in Ohio over whether the governor could get permission, and then when he didn't, whether he could get have a public health officer delay them anyway. There's no question that if we just leave our elections the way they are, we're going to have a real problem in November if the pandemic is still around and nobody knows whether it will be or not. So one of the things that you may be considering now is encouraging your states to revise your election processes to make them safer for voters by things like everybody being able to mail in their vote and doing it well in advance. We raised whether you could, as a C3, do advocacy around election processes themselves with the Alliance for Justice, and the Alliance for Justice just sent out a blog that I shared on the brand new coronavirus listserv, the COVID-19. And if you didn't see it, email me and I will send it to you separately. But it clarifies that, in fact, as a C3, you absolutely can do advocacy around improving the election process itself to make sure that it is safe for everybody to exercise their right to vote. And we think that that is, a really important thing for you to consider depending on what your state's processes are as we move into the election season, because we know that you may need your legislatures to amend your processes, and a lot of your legislatures have gone out on recess early to protect themselves. My guess is they're all going to have to come back in special session because we're going into a recession and they're going to have to adjust the state budgets. So you may want to be thinking now about preparing for election processes modifications when they come back in special session. That's a very long description of what you might be wanting to think about, but I did want to put that on your front burner to think about, as well as all the fabulous information Dana's about to share with us. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dana. Thank you so much for doing this, Dana.
Thank you, Debbie. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and thanks to you and to Jasmine for the great support of this project. And thank you to all of you on the phone for your insight that you shared on the SurveyMonkey and in the telephone interviews. That's the core of what I'm going to share with you today. And what is really special about this project is I know firsthand that when you're working in an advocacy organization day to day, it's very hard to have the time to step back and reflect and plan and really think about the big picture. So hopefully what I'm giving you will offer some support in that I've been able to talk with many of you and look at your materials and read your insights and share that back with you so that I'm providing some reflection that you don't have time to normally do. I do want to encourage you to read the report when you get it, because the report includes some very specific concrete examples, and I have to say it was very impressive to talk with all of you and hear the very specific examples and the direct link between your election season strategies and outcomes for children and families. So I really encourage you to at least skim the report and look at those examples. I tried to highlight them in brief ways, and it will give you some great ideas and confidence. And the last thing I want to say by way of introduction is, obviously we all know the challenges of doing this as 501c3s, and we know that we can do election season strategies within the guardrails for 501c3 organizations. And Debbie and I have talked quite a bit about that. I've read through a lot of the Alliance for Justice resources and reread them. So I just want to tell you, some of the things are, pretty clear cut, what you can do and what you can't do. Others have a lot more nuance, as you know, and I know you're all good at nuance. So I just want to emphasize that all of these things can be done as 501c3s. Some of them take some real sensitivity and planning to make sure we're within the guardrails. I also want to just say I'm thinking of all of you and your families right now and hope you are all safe and healthy. I know that we're all distracted during this strange time, so I'm perfectly happy if at a later date you want to think about this more or chat about it or bounce some things off me. I'm very happy to do that and talk with you. And with that, Jasmine, you can go to the first slide. So as you know, we did a Survey Monkey. We got 23 responses. And one of the questions we asked was how your organization defines success for an election season strategy. This was a multiple choice question. And as you can see, those first two bars on the left, the vast majority of respondents said our measure of success is educating candidates and developing candidate relationships. And that was also emphasized in all of the telephone interviews I did. You really all put first the relationship with candidates. And you'll see on this bar graph that influencing platforms and policies are further down the list, but obviously the point of building the relationships and educating candidates is shaping those platforms and policies down the road. So I think the idea of relationships with candidates just really came through in all of the information. Let's go on to the next slide. So again, from everything I looked at, I'm going to distill 3 key ingredients for impact during election season. 1 is what we just talked about, building relationships with candidates. 2 is mobilizing voices for kids. So the idea that we're more powerful when we speak with many voices, and that when we show candidates and elected officials that their constituents really care about children's issues. And 3rd is connecting with a policy agenda. Now these 3 all seem very familiar to you because they're obviously key ingredients for your legislative advocacy. And that's really the main point, is that the most successful election season strategy connects with and links to your legislative advocacy and utilizes your same strengths and connects to the same policy agenda. So let's go to the next slide. And what I can tell you from all that you shared with me, I can say with great confidence that electoral advocacy works. And by that, I mean it builds improvements for children and families. So here's some of the examples. Electoral advocacy can increase clicks and followers, and we all know why that's important. And I'll give you a couple of examples. The Colorado Children's Campaign conducted a whole social media campaign that was very strategically designed. They had grant funding to do it. It was called Campaign for Kids. And they saw with it a 10% increase in their social media followers. And during the election quarter, 75% of visits to their website were brand new visitors. So that's just one example. Another example is Public Citizens for Children and Youth in Pennsylvania. They're part of a year-round coalition called Pre-K for PA. And they have now developed 600 supporting organizations and 20,000 grassroots advocates. In addition to focusing on a legislative agenda, that coalition very specifically says they want to influence candidates during election season. So you can see we can have a big impact. Many of you shared that one of the benefits of election season strategies is stronger partners. Michigan is one example where they work with, they provide technical assistance and infrastructure for local partners to conduct their own candidate debates. And they've seen that both strengthen their partners and create ongoing relationships between the local organizations and elected officials. Another benefit is we get to influence campaign platforms and transition teams. And several of you, New Jersey is one, got to be part of governor's transition teams, and certainly Virginia also got consulted on developing campaign platforms. And then once the new administration begins, being part of the policy agenda. Many of you have talked about how election season strategies can help nurture both executive branch and legislative champions, and that you see the results in policy. And the bottom line is actual policy change. And again, I'm just so impressed with the very specific examples that include child abuse prevention. Several of you saw actual proposals and new funding for census outreach, investments in childcare and pre-K, Medicaid expansion, the expansion of 2-generation strategies, and suicide prevention. So let's go on to the next slide. These are what I would call our bread and butter strategies that virtually all of our partnership members who do any election season strategies do these too. So one is fact sheets for both candidates and for partners. And that connects with the legislative agenda, can incorporate key messaging, and of course, kids count data and other data. And then the other bread and butter strategy is questions, giving constituents and partners questions to ask candidates. And again, that's pretty much a universal strategy by those of us who do electoral advocacy. And it really is a tool to help highlight issues and mobilize the public. Next slide, please. Jasmine, can you go to the next slide? Hello?
Hi, I've just texted her. I'm not quite sure what happened there, but she should move the slide in just a second. Sorry about that.
Okay, well, I'll begin discussion of the next slide while but unlike with candidate elections, we really have the broad range of strategies at our fingertips. And they also allow for really significant policy change for kids, sometimes things that could never be done through legislative advocacy. And of course, they bring a lot of challenges as well. Thanks, Jasmine. Or Debbie, whoever got that up. So,
it's me, Dana. Which slide do you want to be on?
No, you're perfect. That's exactly right. So next strategy with high impact is giving personal briefings to candidates. And many of you noted that you thought this was your most effective strategy. And so it really combines, you know, bringing them your best information, your fact sheets, your issue briefings, and then developing that personal relationship. And Colorado and Nevada gave me very specific examples of how these personal briefings led to funding for census outreach later on. But really, it develops ongoing relationships. I know that my experience in Arizona was even when a candidate lost the election, the relationship could have benefits further on, depending on what else that person did. And so these briefings, you all noted as very highly effective. Another highly effective strategy is having joint policy agendas and events with partners. We mentioned Pre-K for PA that has this large coalition and a common policy agenda. I mentioned Michigan doing candidate debates with partners. There's several members who work with partners on creating site visits for candidates. Several members are part of coalitions that have joint policy agendas. And those activities tend to have high impact because you're building relationships and partnerships and power at the same time as you're building the relationships with the candidates. Another highly effective strategy that came through is candidate debates involving youth. And Virginia, Oregon, and Michigan all really emphasized the unique benefits that come from this. First of all, it makes those debates stand out from any other organization with the youth voices. It also can involve communities and groups who have been underserved and underrepresented. It gets close to, you know, really involving the people who are most affected, being involved in the strategy. And obviously, it doesn't work the same with very young children. It works better with teenagers and young adults. But also, Michigan has done some things with parents as sort of the representative of younger children. So this is a strategy that, you know, I think is very much worth considering. Obviously, takes a lot of planning, a lot of sensitivity, One of the things that stood out about this is candidates really notice it and are interested in it because it is so different. And then other events. I want to note that many of you emphasize that sort of traditional candidate debates are not the best strategy for you, partly because we all know that a lot of candidates will not participate. And I think anyone who's watched any of these Democratic presidential debates can agree that the format doesn't really invite deeper conversation on the issues. So a lot of you really have developed alternative forms of events. And if we go to the next slide, we'll give some examples of that. Debbie, could you advance to the next slide? So not your father's candidate debate. Many of you have done issue forums, and of course you can do all different kinds of formats for that. You can highlight one issue, multiple. An advantage of that is you're involving your partners, and candidates who participate can see firsthand the broad coalition that we have. You can invite candidates to give a brief statement or be on a panel or participate. Just want to remind you that when you invite candidates, you should invite all candidates running for the same office. And the Alliance for Justice also notes there's special rules for candidates running for federal office, and there's more restrictions on what you can ask them to do at events. So I encourage you, if you're involving federal candidates, make sure you look at the guidelines. Arkansas and Oklahoma have done Facebook Live debates, which have the benefit of you don't have to go to the expense and planning of finding a large venue and filling it. And of course, the link then is available throughout election season and after, and candidates are more and more comfortable with that format. We talked about helping local partners sponsor debates. Several of you are doing that. Kentucky started in the fall of 2019 a podcast, and they invited gubernatorial and attorney general candidates to, one-on-one interviews. So it's not a debate. It's a one-on-one interview in the podcast, and it's been extremely successful. They've had very great conversations with all of the candidates they originally invited, agreed to participate. And because it was so successful, other candidates have been calling them and other elected officials saying, I want to be part of the podcast. And they actually saw a link between those conversations and those relationships and policy. Specifically, the Attorney General who won the election, his very first public event, he convened with Kentucky youth advocates and focused on child abuse prevention. Another type but several of us have tried asking voters to pledge certain things during election season, and it certainly can be a way to motivate people and communicate with them. But a lot of you noted that it's really hard to get traction unless you have the resources for an intensive social media campaign or local organizing. And then partnership members tend to do much less of voter registration and get out the vote activities. Most of us are not set up as grassroots or reaching, large numbers of voters, so that was not surprising to me. I know in Nevada they have done some, they did a Get Out the Vote concert, and have done some other voter registration and voter outreach activities. North Carolina is gearing up to really work on helping nonprofit partners work on voter registration and turnout with their own clients and staff. So again, I think these strategies are still worth considering, but it takes some nuance to bring an impact from them. All right, let's go to the next slide. So this is, again, from all of your input, kind of the opportunities in 2020 and beyond where we can have even greater impact. One is elevating youth voices, and we discussed that a bit. Again, those 3 states that I talked to were very happy with the impact they created, while acknowledging it takes a lot of intensive planning and resources to do that well. Another opportunity is going local. Several of you noted that you see that you have more impact when you can, for example, customize your fact sheets or your data by legislative district or by county or even by congressional district, that candidates pay more attention. If you can put out data by district for, people getting services in their district or needs and outcomes in their district. And several of you noted that when you work with local partners and really help strengthen local partners, it gets a lot more attention from candidates, which makes sense because they're looking at constituencies in their own district. So that was a theme that really came through. Another theme that I know we're all on the journey toward race, equity, and inclusion, and certainly election season strategies are an important place to do that as well. So really, I see that partnership members are talking about race during election season, and that includes disaggregating data for your fact sheets, having questions for candidates that focus on race, and talking about policy options in terms of their impact on race equity. So certainly we have an opportunity to continue to elevate that. In the report, you'll see I gave examples from both Colorado and Arkansas with specific questions for candidates. I think really thoughtful questions, and you can see kind of 2 different versions, questions for candidates about race equity. Another opportunity for greater impact is highlight and streamline. I know as multi-issue advocates, we really try to cover a lot of information on a lot of issues, and we tend to try to communicate all of that, both to our partners and to candidates. And I think it's worth considering highlighting and streamlining, and instead of trying to transmit all of the information, pick and choose and prioritize. And I know that's very hard because I have lived that, but several of you talked about how you're trying to do that. Several partnership members really highlighted, even when they're part of joint policy agendas, that they're working with their coalitions to pick 1, 2, or 3 top policy priorities to highlight, to focus on, while not ignoring the rest, but to help grab attention. North Carolina specifically talked about when they do questions for candidates, they limit it to 3 questions because they think that's really as much as people can internalize. And that's pretty different than most of us are doing 30 to 50 questions for candidates, 8 to 10 fact sheets with a lot of factoids and information. So that's something worth thinking about to capture attention in this information overload environment we live in. And last but not least is to focus on policy positions. Again, that sounds obvious, but sometimes we, again, as we're transmitting a multitude of information and also kind of following the theme of vote for kids, we're trying to communicate everyone should be a child advocate. And sometimes it's hard for candidates and voters to get their arms around what that means. And so several of you noted that where you see the biggest impact is when you connect what your election season strategies and information and messaging are with your specific policy agenda. That's easy to do with ballot issues. It can be done also with other policy issues, legislative and administrative. So it takes some focus and also some sensitivity to make sure we're within the 501c3 guidelines, but I think it can really help crystallize and mobilize people when they can get their hands on something very concrete. And with that, let's see, if we go to the next slide, this has my email address, and then there's one more slide. This was Debbie's brilliant idea of kind of summarizing by objective the types of strategies that seem to work best for different objectives. So you see we have 4 quadrants: build relationships with candidates, educate candidates, connect candidates with voters, and then mobilize partners and voters. Obviously, a lot of these cross over and can be in several quadrants, but I tried to really emphasize the main objective of different types of strategies to just help you think about, in your own environment and your context, what is the most important and what are some of the strategies our colleagues have tried that might work the best. So with that, again, I want to just say I am so impressed with your work and excited about the impact we're making as child advocates. And Debbie, I'll turn it over to you to moderate some Q&A.
I am sorry about that. We are obviously still learning how to manage this remotely. We do fine when we're in the office, but we're having some challenges otherwise. So let me just get into the chat box here, and I do apologize for the problems that we're having. Jasmine kicked out, and then I had to get us back into, sharing my screen, which I wasn't prepared for. And I need to get us in the chat box. Here we go. So we do have some questions. And Stephen Werner in Alabama says, Alabama does not have any in-state debates this year. Can you go more into the rules around state elections? And Dana, I don't know if you feel capable of answering that or if you want to talk a little more about the process. Stephen, we did talk a little bit about that on our webinar last week, and I do want to make sure that everybody on this webinar knows that the Alliance for Justice will take phone calls from any of you to answer the rules around any of what Dana has been talking about. But Dana, do you want to talk about either the rules or the processes of state debate?
I'm not sure I understand the question when you say there are no debates, but the basic rule is invite all candidates who are running for the same office. There are ways to exclude sort of minor party candidates. There have to be objective criteria for that. And again, I encourage you to consult with Alliance for Justice. There are some cases where you should not proceed if only one candidate has agreed. And again, I don't know all the ins and outs of that. Sometimes it's okay to proceed and sometimes it's not. I'm not sure if that answers any of your questions.
Dana, what he said is there's no elections in his state, and I'm sure what he means is state elections this year, because obviously they have a presidential election too. I just think he's trying to understand what happens in the years when they do have elections. But Stephen, if I'm misunderstanding you, please let me know. This report that we commissioned for Dana is definitely meant to be a long-term guide to you and not just for 2020. But please add if you've got an elaboration on the question. And in the meantime, does anyone else have comments or questions for Dana? And if not, and be patient with me here because of our technology challenges, I am going to go in and see if I can unmute you all so that we can have an open discussion, but I'm not promising that I can pull this off. Jasmine is our usual Zoom expert, and unfortunately, she is the one who isn't having internet right now. Jasmine, do you want to tweet me if there's something I can do to unmute them all, or text me? And I do apologize for all our technical glitches here today. Dana, you know what? I hate to say this, but I think you're going to have to put your questions out there, and we'll take their comments in the chat box. And I'm really sorry about that, but we do just have this.
I'm sorry, say that again.
I know you wanted to have an open conversation. Or wait, Jasmine, did you just unmute everybody? I think she did. So Dana, why don't you go ahead and ask your questions to start the conversation?
Oh, I didn't have anything specific. I just wanted to have the opportunity for an exchange of ideas if folks wanted to either make comments or elaborate on anything or ask a question.
Oh, she's working on undoing the attendees. If you want to make a comment in the chat box in the meantime, please do that. And she may be able to unmute your phone lines in just a moment.
I think she's already done it.
Great. Go ahead, Rich.
No, I didn't have a question. I was just letting you know she's already done it.
Okay. Well, I have a question for all of you to kind of kick this off. This is an incredibly weird year for us because of your legislative sessions ending early. And I'm wondering if any of you are thinking about electoral strategies for this fall and what you're thinking about. And while you're all thinking about that, Kelly, yes, the slides and webinar recording will be made available to everybody. Jasmine and I may need to patch it together out of part on her computer and part on ours. So it may take us a day or two, but we'll get you the recording and all the slides and the report that Dana wrote. But who's thinking about electoral advocacy this fall and what?
So this is Stephen with Alabama, and to clarify my question, we have quadrennium, we're halfway through, so we have no in-state elections this year, but we have several very hotly contested federal elections, primarily at the congressional level. And our runoffs in 3 or 4 of our districts have been delayed till the middle of July, so we actually have time to get involved in them if there's a place to do so. So we're just trying to figure out what that looks like as we move forward in November.
Is there anyone on the call who has done debates around federal Senate or House races?
And not necessarily debates so much as some of the other strategies that it may be more effective.
Oh, so you're looking for general strategies for engaging in federal advocacy in your state around elections. Any thoughts?
So, Stephen, this is Dana. One of the things that several partners mentioned that could certainly be done for federal candidates is providing questions to both the media and other partners who are sponsoring debates. So making sure that children's issues are somehow integrated and on the radar screen. And so that's something that I would suggest considering, in addition to fact sheets on key issues. And if you can customize the data by congressional district, that's always helpful.
Is anyone else thinking about federal election advocacy?
Yes, this is Ben Geese from Kentucky Youth Advocates. Can you all hear me?
Go ahead, Ben.
Yes, thank you. First, thanks for giving us the kind shout out about our podcast, and that is relating to my question. We're going to have a number of high-profile state elections with our state house up for election, re-election this year, and of course our federal elections as well. If we're evaluating doing a more traditional sort of question and answer session or something like our podcast, it sounds like, in your views, continuing to do a podcast where both candidates have equal time, have a deeper discussion, that's probably more preferable than a more traditional debate setting. Is that correct?
Well, I hate to answer, cut and dried that one strategy is always better than another, because all of you are good at adjusting strategies to your local circumstances. But from everything, I've gathered, I think some of these other formats, including the podcast, can be more effective. And then also consider doing some type of debate involving youth voices. So working with youth leadership groups or involving other youth in both planning the event and asking the questions and choosing the topics. Those were some of the key things that Michigan and Virginia and Oregon noted, is really focusing on the topics that matter most to youth. Again, give it a more relevant urgency than sometimes when we as professional advocates choose the topics.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you for that. I appreciate it.
And Dana, this is Rich. One thing that occurs to me is, if this COVID-19 situation goes on for months, and that there might be a way to get creative with the social media habits of youth advocates, given that they're likely to be on their phone for much of the time that they're off, and this thing drags on for months. There may be some ways to tap into their own social media networks around this whole situation.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Figure it out, but it strikes me that there may be some viral networking opportunities there involving youth. Given that they are all about phones and social media and all that.
I'm going to ask another question of you guys. Given this strange and likely to be even more unpredictable year, what's going to be helpful for you guys as you think this through? Do you guys want a partnership election listserv to have conversations? Do you want to have those conversations on the COVID-19 listserv, since it's going to be so interwoven with the medical concerns? Dana's report, I really believe, will be valuable to all of you, and we encourage you to think about sharing it with potential funders. What else can we do to support your electoral advocacy?
One of the things, this is Stephen from Alabama, one of the things that's often muddied the water is the same conversation tied to redistricting and some of the other things that are coming down post December 31st with the census. And so for me, it's differentiating between what's electoral, what's advocating at the redistricting and voter disenfranchisement level, and sort of the larger voting picture.
Well, that's a good set of questions. I do know that Flo Gutierrez at Casey is trying to put together webinars on redistricting and another related topic, and those will be open to all partnership members, and so we'll make sure you hear about those. But do you want to elaborate a little bit on what you're trying to figure out?
We spent the last year and a half very heavily involved in census work, and so we've built political capital at the county level across the state, and it's transitioning that, or pivoting that political capital, for lack of a better term, into what is the next set of campaigns that continues to engage with folks that are not traditionally child advocates. How do we utilize that in a way that continues to develop them as advocates for children, but also walks the line of impacting change when it comes to redistricting and voter engagement, and voter access, and then the actual elections themselves.
So this sounds like you would like to have those webinars sooner rather than later.
I'm working from home, so yes.
All right, let me talk to Flo about that. Anybody else? What would be helpful for you? All right, Dana, do you have any last thoughts you want to share with everybody?
Stay safe and healthy, and let me know if I can help with anything.
Great. Thank you so much for this wonderful webinar. I think you you managed to get all of these critical points across despite our technical difficulties, and I really appreciate that. And thank you for your patience with our technical difficulties. And we will, as I said before, share this recording, the slides, Dana's report, and the blog from the Alliance for Justice. I do encourage you, if you have specific technical questions about the rules, to reach out to the Alliance for Justice. As Dana said, everything in her report is C3 appropriate, but it is also true that sometimes if you do little funky tweaks that you think are fine, they might not be. So it's always a good idea to get a final run past them to make sure. And if you think of a way that we can support your electoral advocacy efforts in 2020, let us know. And please consider sharing Dana's report with funders and potential funders as you seek resources to work on both your individual issue campaigns, all the work that Dana's talking about, and possibly the improving the processes to protect them for public health reasons. Having said that, stay safe, stay well. I look forward to being in touch electronically with all of you, and have a productive rest of the day.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Thanks.
Bye-bye. Thank you.